invasion fiasco in April of 1961, President John Kennedy attempted to reel in the CIA for the first time since its creation in 1947. What Kennedy soon learned, however, was that reforming and containing the CIA proved more challenging than anticipated. Despite proclaiming to close advisors that he wanted to, quote, splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind, he was soon faced with the reality that the Langley spooks were not going to give up their grip on America's covert action capabilities peacefully. In reality, the spy agency remained more powerful than ever under the Kennedy White House, resisting most of the attempts by the young president to contain their operations. Throughout their next 2 years and a half in office, John Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, would continuously struggle to control the CIA in their ever-expanding web of intrigue on the Gulf Coast, mainly in Florida and Louisiana. This antagonism between the Kennedy White House and Langley brought with it a two-track policy against Cuba. The Kennedy brothers and their self-appointed covert action guru, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, devised the now famous Operation Mongoose, a primarily non-lethal regime change operation set on the idealistic goal of spurring a popular revolution against Castro's government within Cuba, ideally led domestically by the Cuban people themselves. In a perfect world, this would be brought to fruition with the help of a cooperative CIA, which had built over the past 2 years a rich network of Cuban exiles and dissidents in Miami and its surroundings that could be brought into the fold of this operation. But the CIA had different ideas. Unlike the young president, the agency was not interested in handing over their paramilitary programs in the Gulf Coast to the White House. Beyond the goal of killing Castro, these operations had allowed the agency to build up tremendous power domestically, in the southern rim of the US over the past decade. From the lead up to Operation PB Success, otherwise known as the Guatemalan coup in 1954, all the way to the whole Bay of Pigs thing, the CIA had developed significant paramilitary capabilities on the Gulf Coast, capabilities that it was not ready to shut down or hand back over to the Kennedys. So, in parallel with JFK's Operation Mongoose, the CIA continued to run their own unauthorized and consistently contradictory anti-Castro activities out of the Miami station known as JM Wave, largely organized at first under Operation ZR Rifle and increasingly under unofficial and shadowy channels. Despite mounting pressure to close down these targeted assassination and guerrilla training operations by the Kennedy brothers, especially into 1963, CIA-sponsored and privately funded anti-Castro plots proliferated like mad across the post-Bay of Pigs, Florida, and Louisiana coasts. From April 1961 until ultimately the young president's death in November 1963, the Gulf Coast continued to be an absolute hotbed of paramilitary activity. An endless labyrinth of mirrors and deception, where plotters often found themselves unknowingly embroiled in other overlapping plots, conducted by strange or unlikely allies. It has been speculated by countless researchers that this morass of covert activity in the Caribbean would come to spawn the final plot, the one that killed JFK. A plot that I will be slowly advancing towards throughout Season 3. So today, and over the upcoming months, as we approach that fateful day in Dallas, I will be diving headfirst into this swirling nexus of skullduggery and deception, largely concentrated around the CIA's JM Wave station in Miami, Florida, the largest US spy base in the world at the time, and the center of intrigue for the CIA in this claustrophobic power center. With the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, JM Wave was also put through forced reorganization. But as we will see, reorganization was not necessarily a bad thing for the CIA spooks, as the corruption was already deep-seated, and a changing of the guard largely meant much of the same. And that was certainly the case on the Cuba show at the CIA, as the Kennedy shakeup elevated the careers of the new class of covert operators who had patiently been waiting for the retirement of the old guard. Today I will be starting Eyes Wide Open Season 3 with a primer episode, outlining the changes brought on by the Kennedys to the CIA, and with a general overview of the Kennedys' relationship with their spy agency in the immediate Bay of Pigs aftermath. As of today, we are moving on from the Allen Dulles era of the agency, an era that largely encompassed all of the events I've covered on this channel so far. Now we move towards the second iteration of the CIA, as JFK attempted to shake up the spying apparatus of the United States. As we will see, this was a harder task than he or his advisors could ever imagine, a burden that he would carry until his untimely death. Welcome to Eyes Wide Open Season 3, The Road to Dallas.
I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
Welcome to Wix Harmony. Take the speed of AI and pixel-level control to go from words into a full website that's entirely yours to shape. Need a new page, section, or a restyle? Ask Aria, your personal AI agent. And boom, there it is. Flow naturally between generating and doing it yourself. This is the new way to create Wix Harmony.
It's so easy to become a podcaster with Riverside. You just need a concept and a way to record it. First, go to riverside.fm and open an account. When you're ready to record, just hit record to capture high-quality audio and video, all from the comfort of, well, anywhere. Even if the only camera you have is on your phone, with Riverside, you'll still look like a pro. The equipment doesn't matter. You'll get a professional-looking podcast using anything you already have at home. When it comes to editing, it's truly idiot-proof. Even with zero experience, you can create content like an experienced editor using Riverside's AI tools and intuitive editing features. Get transcriptions automatically and use them to edit just like a doc. Or use the chapter timeline, which makes it easier to skim and scan. Ready to share? It's okay if you don't have an audience yet. Everyone needs to start somewhere, and Riverside has the perfect tools to help you reach them, like live streaming or automated social clips using AI to create engagement on YouTube Shorts, TikTok, and Instagram Reels. Your podcast really is just a click away with Riverside. Try it now. It's free.
The Bay of Pigs blunder was a watershed moment not only for the Kennedy administration, who had to face much of the immediate public scrutiny for the failure, but also for the CIA, who behind the scenes had to face the wrath of the deceived president. As the dust settled in the aftermath of the failed naval assault, John and Robert Kennedy set out to reform the CIA for the first time in its history. Director of CIA Allen Dulles, who by this point had been in the position for nearly 9 years, which remains, by the way, to this day the longest tenure in the role, was forced to resign by the end of the year. On November 28, 1961, 7 months after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy presented Dulles with the National Security Medal, an award created in 1947 alongside the creation of the agency itself as the highest honor bestowed to U.S. intelligence officers. The next day, November 29th, the Kennedy White House publicly released a resignation letter signed by Dulles himself. It was his last day at the agency. Allen Dulles' forced exit from the CIA sent shockwaves throughout the intelligence community. As I have shown extensively on this channel since my very first video, Allen Dulles was a titan of American intelligence, both as an operator during World War II and later as a bureaucrat and spy master during his decade-long career as a high-ranking executive at the agency. Dulles was in at the ground floor, and brought with him his cohort of gentlemen spies from the oh-so-social club of the wartime spy agency, the OSS. These were Ivy League men, mostly white-shoe lawyers and bankers from the upper reaches of the American Northeast. With Dulles out in November and his deputies, Air Force General Charles Cabell, and former Yale professor and director of plans Richard Bissell, out by January and February 1962 respectively, it was clear that the young president was making a serious attempt at reclaiming the out-of-control spy agency by cutting off the metaphorical head and resetting with new leadership. What Kennedy would soon learn, however, was that replacing one aging rogue spook with another often meant continuity, and not the reorientation that he had hoped for. Of the 3 forcibly vacated positions at the top of the CIA, JFK only personally appointed one, the new director of Central Intelligence. In retrospect, this may have been his most critical mistake, as we will see. Nonetheless, in September 1961, 2 months before the official Dulles resignation, Kennedy publicly announced that he would be appointing Republican businessman and engineer John McCone as CIA director to replace Dulles. Generally, Kennedy had a habit of appointing Republicans to uniquely challenging roles in his administration. It has been speculated that he chose members of the GOP to fill roles that were quote-unquote doomed to fail, to save the image of fellow Democratic colleagues. For example, Robert McNamara, another Republican businessman, was appointed Secretary of Defense, a role that was under increasing scrutiny as the Hawks pushed for official U.S. intervention in Southeast Asia and Cuba. Much later, in 1963, adding to the puzzling appointments, JFK appointed former Massachusetts Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, a personal rival of Kennedy, to the unenviable job of ambassador to South Vietnam. This strategy effectively positioned his administration as bipartisan and conciliatory, while isolating Democrat appointees from potential failure. CIA Director John McCone could have been one of JFK's quote-unquote doomed to fail Republican appointments. But there were also many other equally compelling reasons that Kennedy, a liberal Democrat, would replace the wily Allen Dulles with another Republican in John McCone. At the time, McCone was known primarily as a businessman. Firstly, as a shipbuilder before and during World War II. You'll remember I mentioned John McCone all the way back in my first war conspiracy video, as McCone's firm employed top China hand Tommy the Cork as a wartime lobbyist. Later, McCone reappeared as an executive at the global manufacturing and telecom conglomerate ITT, a firm that would often serve as an intelligence front for the CIA in several operations in Latin America. Most famously, ITT would serve the agency in several capacities over a decade later during the 1973 coup of Salvador Allende in Chile. So McCone had a bona fide military-industrial background, which led naturally to his appointment as the second Undersecretary of the Air Force very briefly from 1950 to 51. His government career would reach new heights in the late 50s, as he would be appointed as the chairman of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, replacing the now infamous Lewis Strauss, the man who refused to renew J. Robert Oppenheimer's security clearance, and who was portrayed brilliantly by Robert Downey Jr. in the Oppenheimer film. It would be in that role that he would catch Kennedy's attention, specifically in his work uncovering the development of the Israeli nuclear weapons program in 1960. In the final days of the Eisenhower presidency, exactly a month before JFK would assume office, on December 19, 1960, President Ike met with John McCone and several of his top cabinet officials and advisors, including CIA Director Dulles and National Security Advisor Gordon Gray, to discuss the topic of Israeli nuclearization. According to a January 12, 1961 memo detailing the December 1960 meeting, which is on screen and linked below, quote, "The group had come in to talk about the problem raised by information they have received to the effect that Israelis are operating a plutonium production plant," end quote, and that, quote, "Mr. McCone said he would like to suggest that the U.S. insist that the Israelis put this plant under the IAEA safeguards," end quote. By this point, Ike was a lame duck, serving out the last weeks of his second term. But luckily for McCone, the incoming President JFK was impressed by the investigative work of his office in uncovering the secret Israeli nuclear project, and his initiative in suggesting the government approach the Israelis accordingly. This anecdote does sufficiently explain why Kennedy appointed the otherwise obscure Republican businessman to the top job at CIA. His performance at the Atomic Commission proved his trustworthiness and loyalty to the country, and ideally to the young president. And interestingly, the issue of Israeli nuclearization and regulation would continue to plague the JFK administration throughout. Not to mention, this same issue would lead to speculation of an Israeli element within the assassination conspiracy, specifically with the motive of shutting down JFK's attempts at reining in the Israeli nuke project. I will get into that quite a bit later. But as it would have it, the maverick McCone would struggle and largely fail throughout his tenure as CIA director to successfully impose his and the Kennedy brothers' prescribed policy vision on the agency, as internal opposition at the CIA to the new Kennedy program would push the spy agency to continuously circumvent the president and their new top boss's orders. Although Dulles had been replaced with a relative Kennedy loyalist in John McCone, the other two vacancies at Langley were a mixed bag. These two men, Deputy CIA Director General Charles Cabell and Deputy Director of Plans Richard Bissell, had been Allen Dulles' main point men on Cuba. Cabell, and especially Bissell, who as Deputy Director of Plans was specifically in charge of covert operations, were the ones to actually draw up the Bay of Pigs operation and to effectively move assets around in order to orchestrate the invasion. If Kennedy was looking for the rogue element of the CIA that had ushered in the paramilitary explosion in the Caribbean, these two top executives at the agency were some of the most complicit. Cabell, as Deputy Director, was eventually replaced with Lieutenant General Marshall Carter, who had previously served as an aide to General George Marshall while he was Army Chief of Staff during World War II, and followed him as an assistant while he was serving as Secretary of State and Defense during the Truman administration.
Save time creating content and generate a high-quality clone of your voice with 11 Labs. Change the way you record podcasts, voiceovers, and branded content with the #1 AI-powered voice-generating technology. Stop searching for the perfect voice and stop wasting time re-recording take after take. Try 11 Labs for free and start elevating your content today.
Not much has been written about Marshall Carter's time as Deputy CIA Director. He served for 3 years, from April 1962 to April 1965, and if he's mentioned at all, it's usually in a throwaway line. If anything, his omission in the sources I've read anyways indicates that Carter was somewhat of a non-entity during this time in the Deputy Director role. The young president had much more to be concerned about regarding the replacement of the conniving outgoing Director of Plans, Richard Bissell. Bissell had been the main architect of the Bay of Pigs operation, bringing back the same team that had successfully undertaken the Guatemalan coup d'etat in 1954, this time to undertake the failed invasion. Not to mention that the outgoing DDP had also been the one to put into motion the CIA's alliance with organized crime elements in their ongoing attempts to assassinate Castro. If JFK wanted to point to one major culprit for the operational blunders of the recent Bay of Pigs fiasco, Bissell was a top contender. Seemingly out of good faith, or maybe out of fear of retaliation, Kennedy offered an olive branch to Dr. Dick Bissell, offering him a new role at CIA as the head of a new science and technology department. He even allegedly offered the former Yale professor to head the development of what would eventually become the Lockheed A-12 spy plane, the replacement for the aging U-2. I will remind you, alongside his duties as Director of Plans, Richard Bissell also headed the CIA's spy plane and Corona spy satellite programs. This placed Bissell at a crossroads between the covert action of the CIA and the burgeoning military-industrial complex. So Kennedy's offer of the top job at a new science and tech department at CIA seemed reasonable. and JFK likely viewed this as a good opportunity to disarm the former covert operations expert, while allowing him to maintain his dignity. Ultimately, Bissell declined the offer, and by February 1962, he was also gone from the CIA, taking a job at the Institute for Defense Analysis, a Pentagon-funded think tank that offers advisory services on military R&D projects. A very similar position to what he would have gotten at CIA under the Science and Technology Department, but without the oversight of the weary president and his hand-picked director. It was Bissell's chosen replacement that should have signaled to the White House that despite their efforts at reorganization, the CIA appeared to have no desire for reform. On February 17, 1962, Richard Helms was elevated to the top covert operations position at CIA. Helms had somehow completely skirted any association with the Bay of Pigs fiasco from his high perch, largely overlooking operations in Europe. To outsiders such as the Kennedy brothers and their Camelot advisors, Helms appeared to be a fresh face for the Directorate of Plans, and a marked shift away from the clique that had developed the doomed-to-fail invasion. However, as the White House soon discovered, Helms's appointment allowed the old boys to remain in control of their agency, for the time being anyways. Maybe aside from Allen Dulles and counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton, Dick Helms remains arguably the most enduring symbol of the CIA's WASP old boy origins. Born in Pennsylvania as the son of Herman Helms, a corporate executive at Alcoa, one of the world's largest aluminum producers, Dick Helms came from the same upper-crust background as his other old boy colleagues. Although his father Herman was a fairly successful businessman in his own right, Helms's pedigree came first and foremost from his maternal side, primarily from his grandfather, the famous international banker Gates W. McGarrah. McGarrah most notably served as the first president of the Basel, Switzerland-based Bank for International Settlements, from its creation in 1930 until 1933. BIS, as it was known, was originally founded to facilitate Germany's reparation payments outlined in the Treaty of Versailles. BIS, which still exists to this day as one of the major global central banks, is most known for its work after McGarrah's leadership laundering Nazi loot during World War II. This was done under the leadership of American banker Thomas McKittrick, whom I first covered in Part 2 of the History of the CIA series due to his close personal friendship with none other than Allen Dulles. These close connections at the upper reaches of the financial elite served to exemplify how the young Richard Helms came from much the same world as his future CIA colleagues. His descendants from the prominent McGarrahs placed him within the ranks of Wall Street royalty, and made his entry into the elite world of the early OSS and CIA seamless. According to John Prados in his book The Ghosts of Langley, Helms's father made the timely decision to cash out his stock before the market crash of 1929, and thus the younger Helms was unaffected by the hardships of the Great Depression. As a boy in the early 1930s, he studied at the prestigious Institut Le Rosey in Switzerland, an elite boarding school that hosted the children of aristocrats, world leaders, and the world's top businessmen. There, he likely developed his expensive taste and Europhile attitude that would follow him throughout his career. I should also note here that Helms attended Le Rosey at the same time as the future Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, and allegedly the two became friends. This was the beginning of a lifelong affinity between Helms and the Pahlavi dynasty of Iran, themselves the beneficiaries of substantial CIA support over their reign. In 1953, the CIA would help overthrow the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Mossadegh of Iran to reinstall the tyrannical Shah. By this point, Helms was serving the Directorate of Plans at CIA, and he was surely happy his old schoolboy pal was given a hand by the agency. But it wouldn't be until 20 years later in 1973, only a couple of months after Helms was forced to retire from his role as director of CIA, that he would officially reunite with Mohammad Reza Shah. On April 5, 1973, President Nixon appointed the outgoing spy master to be his ambassador in Tehran, serving in that capacity for over 3 years until December 1976. In this role, according to Joseph Trento, Dick Helms helped secure a steady stream of weaponry for the increasingly unstable Shah from his old colleagues at CIA. These colleagues included men such as Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins, and the roguish Ed Wilson, the likes of whom sketched the early arms trafficking networks that would evolve into Iran-Contra a few years later. But before Helms became the consummate spy master that we know him as today, like so many future OSS agents, he started his career in journalism at UPI in the late 30s, where he worked throughout Europe as a correspondent until the start of the war. After the US entry into the war in 1941, Helms volunteered for service. First posted as a naval reservist in the New York Command Center, he was quickly approached by German UPI bureau chief Friedrich Exner. Exner allegedly proposed that the young Helms join the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, the US's wartime spy agency directed by Wall Street lawyer Wild Bill Donovan, specifically in a new propaganda unit. Given Helms's journalistic experience abroad in Europe, this appeared to be a perfect fit. At first, allegedly, he declined. But within a few months, Helms was within the fold of the first class of future CIA agents at the new OSS. He served in the OSS in Europe, working as a coordinator of intelligence from Germany. This would have likely been the first interaction between the budding spymaster Helms and future CIA director Allen Dulles. During World War II, Dulles was producing some of the most valuable intelligence regarding Nazi activities from his post in Bern, Switzerland. Allegedly, they even bunked together in the last days of the war when the OSS was relocated temporarily to Paris. For the German intelligence czar Helms, Dulles was an invaluable fount of information. As indicated by several contemporaneous memos, which I have on screen now, Helms was apprised of the secret operation to absorb Nazi intelligence chief Reinhard Gehlen's intelligence network, which he had developed during the war as the head of military intelligence on the Eastern Front. This absorption was under Operation Rusty, and to Helms's credit, he did oppose the integration of Gehlen's network, quote-unquote, largely on the grounds of security, according to the memo. Despite these concerns, the Gehlen network was brought into the West German intelligence apparatus, and would soon be known as the Gehlen Org. Finally, Reinhard Gehlen's organization would eventually morph into the official intelligence agency of the West German state, the BND, with himself as the first director. Richard Helms was involved at the ground floor of the OSS CIA program, and was also privy to some of the most explosive secrets, such as this unspeakable alliance between Nazi intelligence and the US occupation government in Germany. This, in a sense, inducted him into a small club of those in the know about one of the most high-stakes secrets of the early Cold War. John Prados notes that while the likes of Allen Dulles, disillusioned by Truman's shutdown of his wartime spy agency, left the intelligence community altogether during the short interagency period after the dissolution of the OSS in 1945, Richard Helms remained, serving in the short-lived Central Intelligence Group and other prototypical spy centers. He would then be a founding member of CIA in 1947, and one of the top agents in the first clandestine class at the Office of Policy Coordination, the first iteration of the CIA's covert operations arm. Under arch-schemer Frank Wisner, Helms cemented himself as one of the most experienced covert planners in the young agency. Helms was the originator and main overseer of MKUltra, the CIA's infamous brainwashing and drug experimentation program, as well as Operation Chaos, a largely unknown program, but allegedly a domestic intelligence program with the purpose of spying on US-based leftist organizations and opposition trade unions, comparable to the FBI's COINTELPRO. All that to say, when in 1962, outgoing DDP Richard Bissell was replaced with incoming Richard Helms by CIA Director John McCone, Kennedy's attempt to shake up the covert operations desk at CIA was essentially null and void. The OSS old boy, bespoke suit-wearing gray eminence Richard Helms would do everything in his capacity to maintain the CIA's autonomy in face of the Kennedy brothers' meddling, especially when it came to illegal domestic CIA operations. As expanded by Warren Hinkle and William Turner in their incredible book The Fish is Red, about the secret war against Castro. And by the way, this has quickly become one of my favorite reads of the year, so if you can find it, I highly recommend picking it up. It's awesome. Anyways, pulling from The Fish is Red, quote, "At age 48, tall, with thinning black hair, Helms had pushed his way up the CIA ladder by playing the role of gray flannel bureaucrat to perfection. Helms's style was the unwritten word, the implicit suggestion, the dangling participle, the semantic evasion. He avoided making enemies by slowly starving an operation he didn't like, rather than lopping it off. He was regarded as Mr. Cool, as in ice." End quote. The infinitely cagey and famously uncooperative Helms would remain the gatekeeper of CIA secrets and operational autonomy for the large part of 3 presidential administrations. First, as Director of Plans under Kennedy, and the first years of the Johnson administration. That is until good old boy LBJ, an insider in his own right, elevated Helms to the Director of CIA role in 1966, replacing Kennedy's lame duck appointee John McCone. From there, Helms would serve until 1973, heading the CIA during the majority of the Vietnam War and the Watergate period. During the so-called Year of Intelligence, 1975, wherein the CIA was subjected to several House inquiries into their activities, most famously the Church Commission, following their implicit role in Watergate, the former director of CIA, Richard Helms, would successfully keep a large portion of the damning information about the agency away from the public. He ordered all files on MKUltra and Chaos destroyed at once, and to this day, we only have tangential and largely accidental documentation on these unconstitutional criminal programs. But even before being elevated to the DCI position, according to several accounts, Helms acted as the de facto director in the early 60s from his subordinate role as Director of Plans under John McCone. According to journalist and RFK Justice Department official John Siegenthaler, a Kennedy loyalist in the administration, quote, "It was clear that McCone was out of the loop. Dick Helms was running the agency," end quote. Before all that, in his early years at CIA, Helms was in charge of the Foreign Branch M, the prestigious Eastern European branch covering arguably the most significant intelligence hotspot of the first years of the Cold War. Helms's later promotion under Kennedy to Deputy Director of Plans in '62 would ultimately reunite him with former colleagues from the European days. Because as it turned out, Richard Bissell, his predecessor, had in February 1961 elevated the former CIA station chief from West Berlin to head a new assassination program at CIA, a man that Helms had surely encountered during his time working on the Eastern European desk for the agency. After spending 8 years in charge of the busiest CIA station in the world at the time, in the divided German capital, William King Harvey was called back to Washington, D.C. to head the CIA's quote-unquote executive action program, known under the cryptonym ZR Rifle. And early the next year, in 1962, new Director of Plans Dick Helms would place Harvey at the top of Task Force W, the CIA's Cuba Action Group. And as we will see later, Helms would lean on Harvey and the JM Wave station to proceed as they had before in their anti-Cuba operations, in defiance of the president. What ultimately ended up manifesting under Kennedy's short presidency after the Bay of Pigs mess was something of a 2-track policy on Cuba. JFK would struggle to find consensus within his divided administration, split amongst the old guard establishment Yankees, mostly Cold Warrior types, and a group of young officials later to be known as the New Frontiersmen, idealistic liberal internationalists that largely supported détente and coexistence with the Soviet Union, its satellites, and Cuba. Although it remains up for debate, according to testimonies by New Frontiersmen and consistent anecdotal evidence, JFK
The key to being rich, it's knowing what counts. It's investing in a little inspiration. Our financial advisors help clients find their rich and build financial plans to help them get there. Let's find your rich. Edward Jones.
especially following his falling out with the CIA, clearly and consistently indicated that he would not sanction the CIA's efforts to assassinate foreign leaders. I say this is up for debate because there is a certain revisionist strain within Kennedy-era research that posits a certain quote-unquote dark Camelot narrative, wherein JFK sought in reality, amongst other dirty tricks, to assassinate foreign leaders much like his predecessors. Conspicuously, much of the evidence of JFK's sanction of assassination comes from people who were themselves intrinsically linked to the CIA's ZR rifle program. Figures such as Bill Harvey, the ZR rifle czar, and Ted Shackley, the CIA station chief in Miami. JFK adhered to the golden rule of international politics, that being, simply, rulers of countries do not kill rulers of other countries. This is the golden rule because what could be done to them, i.e. an assassination, could also be done to the leader ordering it themselves. JFK described this to his aide, Dick Goodwin, stating that he opposed assassination schemes, stating, quote, "We can't get into that kind of thing, or we would all be targets," end quote. Kennedy had shown already in his short time as president that he was shaken by assassinations of foreign leaders. This famous photo, taken February 13th, 1961, weeks after he took office, shows JFK looking devastated as he hears the news for the first time of the slaying of the Congo's post-independence nationalist leader, Patrice Lumumba, some 4 weeks earlier. Lumumba, a nationalist and not a communist, had been killed at the hands of Belgian and CIA-backed militias in the breakaway state of Katanga. We know now that the CIA had conceived of several plots to assassinate Lumumba, using poisons developed by Sidney Gottlieb and his technical services shop at Langley. It was, however, not the CIA who ultimately assassinated Lumumba, but Belgian-backed rebels. The Belgian government even formally apologized in 2002 for their role in the slaying. The killing of Patrice Lumumba on January 17, 1961, some 3 days before JFK entered the White House, served as an ill omen for the days to come for the new frontier president. Yet at the CIA, the assassination programs conceived before JFK's entry into the Oval Office would proceed quietly, despite continued urging from the president to cease such activities. There were even indications that some of the president's White House secretaries and advisors potentially knew about and hid the fact that the CIA had been developing so-called quote-unquote executive action capabilities over the past couple of years, and was continuing to do so despite JFK's opposition. These would come to include the president's own brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who, as we will see later, held less reservations about the use of assassination plots to dislodge Castro. Whereas John Kennedy was vocally opposed to executive action directed at foreign leaders, Bobby's view on the subject was a bit more lenient. Bobby would, of course, come to oppose assassination programs following his brother's untimely death, allegedly at the hands of some of the very elements that his office tacitly promoted. Yet in 1961, having been assigned to oversee the White House anti-Castro operations, Bobby appeared to be open to such executive options in his singular mission to bring down the Castro government in Cuba. As we will see, he may have even sanctioned the continued use of mafia figures in CIA murder plots, amongst other controversial operations. RFK's openness to using assassination as a tool of statecraft does often get unfairly projected onto his president brother. As I will show, this does not paint an accurate picture of John Kennedy's own personal position on the matter of US-sanctioned murder programs. This divergence in policy between the president and his cabinet is exemplified by Hinkle and Turner in their book The Fish is Red. Kennedy's national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, one of the more hawkish voices in the White House, had spoken briefly with outgoing CIA Deputy Director of Plans Richard Bissell about such programs. Bundy naturally kept this to himself. The influential national security advisor had less qualms than the man he was serving on the topic of international assassinations. It happened as well that Mac Bundy and outgoing CIA Deputy Director of Plans Bissell actually knew each other before their timely reunion in the early Kennedy years. Dr. Bissell had taught the pupil Bundy, while Bissell himself was a professor at Yale before his time at CIA. McGeorge Bundy and his brother William, both former students of the spy master Dr. Bissell, came from the highly established Yankee Bundy family, a long-standing New England family of prominent lawyers, politicians, and public servants. The Bundys exuded the same Yankee ethos as the Georgetown Blue Bloods that made up most of the Kennedy administration and, incidentally, also the early CIA. All three Bundys, the father Harvey and his sons McGeorge and William, attended Yale, and all three were members of the ubiquitous Skull and Bones secret society, which was a key gateway to the CIA and spycraft in general for many young spooks. Harvey Hollister Bundy, the father, laid the groundwork for his sons' future government careers as he served under various posts under the legendary Henry L. Stimson, serving first as the Assistant Secretary of State in the 1930s under Stimson in the Hoover administration, and then under Stimson again when he was Secretary of War in the FDR administration. Stimson, the Bundy's father's mentor and boss, also a Yale Skull and Bonesman, would serve in high positions in 7 presidential administrations. During his nearly 5-decade-long government career, Stimson would mentor and shape the incoming class of early Cold Warriors in what became colloquially termed Stimson's kindergarten. This is all according to Chris Milligan in his 2000 article titled Skull and Bones, which I've linked down below as part of a massive Skull and Bones history PDF document that I recommend checking out if it interests you. Anyways, Milligan claims that Stimson's protégés out of the so-called kindergarten included such Cold War heavy hitters as future Truman-era Secretary of State and Defense General George C. Marshall, World War II Assistant Secretary of War OSS architect and future American High Commissioner to U.S.-occupied West Germany, John J. McCloy, future Secretary of State in the Truman administration, Dean Acheson, and fellow Bonesman Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett, who you'll remember as one of Prescott Bush's colleagues at Brown Brothers Harriman. And of course, included in this so-called kindergarten were the aforementioned Bundy brothers themselves, William and McGeorge, who would emerge as 2 of the most influential political operators in Washington, D.C. in the early to mid-1960s. With the right East Coast pedigree and the Stimson endorsement, the Bundy brothers were set on a fast track to the upper echelons of power. William Bundy, the older brother, would follow the route that so many had before, from Yale Skull and Bones directly into a career at CIA, after a few cursory years working as a lawyer at Covington and Burling. Interestingly, during the Kennedy years, William Bundy would be promoted out of the covert realm of the CIA into the Department of Defense, to serve as the deputy to Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, the one and only Paul Nitze. You'll remember Nitze from the War Conspiracy series as the man who penned NSC 68, which laid out for the first time the policy of rollback within the Cold War policy paradigm. Interesting to note that William Bundy would remain under Paul Nitze as the latter was elevated to the Secretary of Navy position on November 29, 1963, 7 days after Kennedy's murder. Nitze, the rollback theorist, would be Secretary of Navy when the Gulf of Tonkin false flag event precipitated American involvement in Vietnam in August of 1964, an event that saw 2 alleged attacks by Vietnamese patrol boats on U.S. Navy ships off the coast of North Vietnam. U.S. Navy ships that I'll remind you were under Nitze's purview as Navy Secretary. And maybe most notably, despite the questionable circumstances of the attack, and later confirmation of the false flag decades later, the Gulf of Tonkin incident gave the Johnson administration just cause to enter Vietnam unilaterally with official U.S. Army troops, essentially paving the way towards the Vietnam War. A war that was set on rolling back communist North Vietnam, just as Navy Secretary Paul Nitze had drawn up in the NSC 68 proposal a decade and a half earlier. His deputy at the time was Bill Bundy, the ex-CIA man whose younger brother in the White House would be one of the architects of the early stages of that upcoming war. And said younger brother, McGeorge Bundy, is of special interest to us as we turn back to the Kennedy years and the Cuba show. Although never an official CIA employee like his brother, McGeorge Bundy did get formal intelligence training during World War II when he served as an intelligence officer in the US Army serving in Europe. After the war, he would pursue a career in academia, but not before firstly ghostwriting a memoir for the aforementioned Henry Stimson, his father's longtime mentor, and then working on the 1948 presidential campaign of Republican candidate Thomas Dewey, former governor of New York and the man who famously gave the sweetheart deal to Lucky Luciano some 5 years earlier to return to his home of Sicily. Interesting that Dewey keeps popping up in pretty much every Eyes Wide Open video. I just wanted to note that because he seems to just poke his head in the most strange places. Anyways, after Dewey's surprise defeat to the incumbent Truman in the '48 election, the young McGeorge Bundy dove headfirst into the Ivy League world that had shaped him. Appointed to the Rockefeller-dominated Council on Foreign Relations, and later becoming a tenured professor in 1953 in the Department of Government at Harvard University, where he served alongside another Rockefeller-sponsored academic, the one and only Henry Kissinger. He was 34 years old at the time and the youngest person to be given tenure at Harvard until 2019. Interestingly, only a couple of years after he was given full professorship at Harvard, Bundy's colleague Kissinger would be called by their mutual benefactor Nelson Rockefeller to join the Special Studies Project, a multi-panel work that I've covered before on this channel, that set out the main blueprint of a quote-unquote limited war, i.e., the future Vietnam War. So to recap, here we have both Bundy brothers coming into close orbit of the fundamental theorists of the militarized Cold War and the upcoming Vietnam War. William Bundy serving under Paul Nitze, the author of the infamous NSC-68, and McGeorge Bundy working alongside Henry Kissinger, a major author of the Special Studies Project. So it may be unsurprising to assert that both Bundys would remain influential within the early Johnson White House, when escalation in Vietnam was seen as inevitable. But it was really Kennedy who elevated McGeorge Bundy to his first real government position in January of 1961 as his national security advisor, serving in the role into the Johnson years until February of 1966. In the new role, Mac Bundy would oversee the transformation of the newly created National Security Advisor role from a somewhat marginal advisory position under President Eisenhower into what it has become today, one of the most influential national security posts in the entire government, with direct access to the president's ear at almost all times. The position was technically created under the Truman-convened National Security Act of 1947, the same act that created the National Security Council, the US Air Force, and the CIA. But the position would not be institutionalized until 1953 under President Eisenhower, with his appointment of Robert Cutler as the first White House-level National Security Advisor. But as I mentioned before, under Ike, the position remained fairly marginal, with the general going through 4 different advisors, including Robert Cutler for 2 non-consecutive terms, throughout his presidency. There may be an argument to be made that Ike's last security advisor, Gordon Gray, was the first to really step into the role, as he did have some impact on the emerging anti-Cuba operations, albeit a marginal impact comparatively to his successors.
The way you see an idea in your mind, the way you describe it to a friend. This is how website creation should be. Expression as natural as thinking. Let it out, shape it into something that could only come from you. This is the new way to create. Wix Harmony.
Your day-to-day covered with Base 44 super agents. Your life is chaotic. Set up a personal assistant in a click. Work, email, documents, your kid's calendar, everything synced and ready to move. Going over your emails, decluttering the noise in a single motion. Prioritizing what's left unread, telling you what needs your attention. Managing your calendars, keeping things clear. Double booking? Forget about it. Conflicts? rescheduled while you sleep. Every task, every meeting, you show up prepared. So you can focus on the things that matter most. And the icing on the cake, it handles that too. Your super agent is waiting. Base 44 super agents.
If we look at all the national security advisors after Gray, we can see that the role following Bundy's appointment gained significant prestige and influence within the White House. Almost all of these men and women can be attributed to significant policy directions of their respective administrations. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that McGeorge Bundy represented the first of a series of national security advisors that came out of Rockefeller-affiliated institutions. Bundy, Kissinger, and finally Brzezinski, to name a few, all emerged from the Rockefeller-sponsored policy shops at the Council on Foreign Relations and Harvard University, and all had an outsized and hawkish influence on the presidents they served. For McGeorge Bundy, in the early years of the Kennedy White House, before the situation in Vietnam took center stage, the Cuba issue remained top of mind as far as national security was concerned. Importantly, Mac Bundy was included in the Special Group Augmented, the Kennedy White House's internal Cuba task force. But due to his long-standing ties and close proximity to several CIA old boys, including his own brother, he likely also had an inside view of the CIA's own internal plots against Cuba. In that sense, Bundy had a partial view of both tracks of the Cuba policy, run by both the White House and the CIA. Finally, JFK put his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, in charge of the White House Cuba Task Force after the events of April 1961, in a similar move to Ike placing Nixon at the top of the Cuba program a few years earlier. At the time, RFK's office was already flooded with work relating to his ongoing nationwide investigation into organized crime and racketeering, investigations that gained additional impetus once he was elevated to the AG chair by his brother. Having served previously as an attorney in the late 1950s on the McClellan Committee with a crusading zeal, Bobby had already made a name for himself as a steadfast opponent of organized crime. This was especially true with regards to Jimmy Hoffa, as their rivalry became nationally famous. As AG, Bobby ramped up these inquiries, focusing his attention as always on Hoffa, but also on the likes of Carlos Marcello of New Orleans and Sam Giancana of Chicago. Somehow, despite the already bogged down Department of Justice, Bobby took on the Cuba show with an equal drive and singular vision. Although White House-sanctioned actions against Castro's Cuba came to a halt for the months immediately succeeding the Bay of Pigs invasion, by the end of 1961, the Kennedy brothers were ready to restart the machine. The CIA had seemingly been reorganized, with the last of the old Bay of Pigs senior staff out early the next year. It was time to start fresh. So in November 1961, JFK brought in an operator to work alongside his brother on the Cuba program. The man he brought in was one we encountered half a decade ago in our timeline, the one and only Edward Lansdale. Recently promoted from colonel to brigadier general, Edward Lansdale had left the CIA some years earlier, shortly after his time advising South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem during the early years of his government. The former CIA counterinsurgency mastermind had since become stuck at a new post at the Pentagon, overseeing covert operations, but this time under the military. Lansdale worked at the Office of Special Operations, a now defunct office at the Pentagon under World War II hero Marine Major General Graves Erskine. Erskine, a gruff Louisianian, had served in World War I, where he sustained a severe injury. Nonetheless, he recovered, reaching his career peak during World War II, serving as the youngest brigadier general in the Pacific. Erskine led the 3rd Marine Division island hopping across the Marshall Islands and the Marianas, and most famously led Marines during the Battle of Iwo Jima. According to fellow podcaster Recluse, aka Steven Snyder, in his book The Art Part 1, which I should take a moment here to shout out Recluse and to say that if you are interested in my show, you should definitely give his podcast a shot. It's called The Farm. He covers many of the same topics I do in great detail. I highly recommend it. He put me onto some topics that I would have never thought to research otherwise. Anyways, so according to his book The Art Part 1, under this leadership, Lansdale's office worked as an oversight body with potential veto power over any intelligence operations from any of the intelligence community, be it from the CIA, the NSA, or the Joint Chiefs. Recluse also notes that the OSO was in charge of Pentagon-led covert operations, essentially making it a prototypical defense intelligence agency, which was not formed until 1961, actually under Kennedy. However, this was not Lansdale's beat. Comparatively to his high-profile experience advising Washington-friendly governments in the Philippines and South Vietnam, the desk job at the Pentagon represented nothing more than a dead end for the PSYOP whiz. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't busy during these years. I might even speculate that instead of working the PR mill for client governments as he had in the past in Asia, Lansdale was busy crafting his own legend. Because you see, since we last saw the gangly former odd man turned counterinsurgency expert Edward Lansdale in Vietnam, his stature in the public imagination had grown substantially. He had no less than 2 prominent novels written at the time that were allegedly based on his likeness. First was Graham Greene's 1955 novel The Quiet American, where a major character, Alden Pyle, a CIA advisor in French Vietnam, was alleged to have been based on Edward Lansdale. Accordingly, Graham Greene himself had spent time in French Indochina during the war there, working as a correspondent for the Sunday Times and the French newspaper Le Figaro between the years of 1946 and 1954. His last tour, at the end of the war in 1954, would have overlapped with Lansdale's time in the country, so their paths could have conceivably crossed. Interesting to also note that Greene famously stayed at Saigon's illustrious Hôtel Continental, a hotbed for purported Corsican mob activity, and where Lansdale's thuggish deputy, Lou Conin, famously corresponded with these Corsican crime elements. These overlaps add credence to a potential meeting between the CIA counterinsurgency ace and the budding novelist in Saigon. Yet, years later, Greene claimed that the character was based on another American bureaucrat in Vietnam, named Leo Hochstetter, not our man Lansdale. Nonetheless, the association between Greene's character and the Pentagon-bound Lansdale persisted at the time, increasing the public recognition of Washington's favorite PSYOP man. Reportedly, Lansdale was not too pleased about his alleged portrayal in Greene's critical novel as the duplicitous Alden Pyle character, forgetting the golden rule of advertising for a second, that all publicity is good publicity. Nevertheless, even though he was revealed to have not been based on the CIA Saigon chief, the ever-persistent Lansdale was later given an opportunity to remodel the image of the Quiet American to his liking. In 1958, The Quiet American novel, by now a bestseller, was adapted into a film for the first time by director Joseph Mankiewicz. Now, instead of faithfully adapting Greene's sober novel, which acted as a cautionary tale of American adventurism in faraway Indochina, Mankiewicz instead opted to adapt the plot of the novel into a celebration of American Cold War power abroad. And you'd never believe it, but according to Stephen Kinzer in his book Brothers, Mankiewicz elicited the help of none other than General Edward Lansdale, freshly back from Vietnam at his new post at the Pentagon, to act as an uncredited script advisor for the film. So in turn, Lansdale, who had never even been the actual inspiration for the character in the first place, was able to craft the screen image of said character to his liking, as it was popularly rumored to be based on himself. The former odd man really had not lost his touch in Vietnam, and from his new, unfulfilling post at the OSO at the Pentagon, it appeared that he continued to quietly craft his own mythology, this time using film and media to craft his ideal image in the American public imagination. Well, if The Quiet American was not based on the Psy-War expert, the character Colonel Hillendale, from William Lederer and Eugene Burdick's 1958 novel The Ugly American, was clearly inspired by the real Colonel Lansdale. That remains pretty much unanimously understood. The character Colonel Hillendale, a counterinsurgency expert first in the Philippines and then in the book's made-up country of Sarkhan, a clear parallel to Vietnam, brought a much more flattering depiction to the real Colonel Lansdale than Green's critical alleged portrayal. Now, as if his alleged depictions in both The Quiet American and The Ugly American were not enough, some years later in 1965, coincidentally, while Lansdale was just back in Vietnam for his second tour at the US Embassy in Saigon, the novel Yellow Fever by Jean Lartiguy was released, which also featured a character that was suspiciously similar to the by now well-known covert operator. Now let's take a step back here. Doesn't it seem strange that Edward Lansdale, the CIA PSYOP expert and former advertising executive, was popularly known as the inspiration for 3 characters in prominent contemporary novels? If you have researched Lansdale at all, these connections to the novels The Quiet American and The Ugly American specifically are unavoidable. Pretty much every biographical work, magazine article, journal article, or blog about Lansdale makes note of this fact, that he was the inspiration for contradictory characters in popular 1950s novels. Since we know that Lansdale was already involved in his image crafting through his work on the Quiet American film script, I will once again posit my personal theory that the former advertising executive could have been running some sort of PR campaign to bolster his own image from his sleepy post at the Pentagon. This is purely speculation on my part, and it would have involved Lansdale working alongside authors and publicists to first include his likeness in the novels, and then later for reviewers and commentators to note the comparisons in public. Now again, this may not have been happening at all, as outside of his work with Mankiewicz, there is no solid proof that he was in touch with any of the authors or the press that publicized these likenesses. But I can't help but note here that if he was indeed running such a campaign, it could be considered a massive success, as the Kennedy brothers requested him specifically for the Cuba task force at the White House, saving him from his Pentagon exile. And in November of 1961, the swashbuckler Lansdale was brought into the White House to lead the new Kennedy-devised anti-Castro program, codenamed Mongoose.
I found out the hard way what a missed connection feels like on IG. You're on Instagram, checking DMs, posting stories, but you're also editing content, scheduling posts, actually running your business. And that's when it happens. A comment asking about your product, buried. A new follower ready to engage, ghosted. A DM from somebody ready to buy, missed. By the time you see it, never mind, found it somewhere else. Each one, a missed connection. A sale going poof. Unless you're using ManyChat. With ManyChat, nothing gets missed. Someone comments, instant DM. New follower, automatic welcome. Someone shares your post, immediate thank you. Automatically, every time. While you keep doing what you're doing, sales happen whether you're online or not. And the best part, it's ridiculously easy to set up, like only a few minutes. Over 1 million creators are already using ManyChat. Why aren't you? See what you've been missing. Get started for free today.
You write the words. What if you could hear them as a song? Go to suno.com, switch to custom mode, and paste in your lyrics. Then describe the sound. I'll go with soulful R&B ballad, emotional vocals, piano driven. Hit create. Suno turns your writing into 2 fully produced songs. Your words sung back to you with real production behind them. Now shape it. Remix to hear your lyrics in a completely different genre. Rewrite sections to tighten the phrasing. Extend to build the full track. You can also use Suno to face writer's block head on. Create new lyrical ideas and flourishes that you can then reinsert to complete your composition. Your lyrics fully produced from a paste and a prompt. See what your words can become. Subscribe at suno.com.
Lansdale was likely selected by the Kennedys not only for his high-profile persona, but also his reputation as a comparative liberal within the covert action space. The PSYOP man, as he had become known, believed much like the Kennedys that third world communist guerrilla movements were better countered by providing for and propagandizing for a suitable Western-backed alternative, instead of the conventional approach of suppressing the communist rebels through hard-handed tactics. Lansdale's actual adherence to his quote-unquote hearts and minds principle remains in question, as rumors of atrocities committed by his advised forces in the Philippines in the post-war period, and the brutal repression of his client in South Vietnam, President Ngo Dinh Diem, do go counter to his popular depiction as a proponent of non-violent counterinsurgency tactics first and foremost. For JFK, Lansdale seemed to be the man for the job in the post-Bay of Pig days. Like the president, Lansdale appeared to prefer the US fight the Cold War through, as Kennedy called them, various quote-unquote small wars, otherwise known now as counterinsurgency campaigns, instead of engaging in typical full-scale military campaigns, as would eventually materialize in Vietnam under JFK's successor. For Lansdale, the Kennedy call-up presented an alliance of convenience. Brought back from his dismal appointment at the Pentagon, the old Vietnam hand was finally brought back into the thick of covert operations planning on the ground, his true calling. Yet Lansdale had always been a slippery man, and his allegiances were not always easy to distinguish. As we will see, Lansdale was also deeply embedded in the various antagonistic networks swirling around the Kennedys at the same time. His closeness to these elements, especially the CIA and Army intelligence circles, would bring Lansdale to the center of many theories of the Kennedy assassination, as we will continue to see. But for now, it is important to emphasize Lansdale's experience as an advertising executive and Psy-War expert in the context of Operation Mongoose. Many authors have suggested that Operation Mongoose, despite its threatening name and purported goal of fomenting a popular revolution in Cuba through grassroots agitation, remained more of a showpiece than a legitimate attempt to dislodge the Castro government. By February 1962, some 3 months after Lansdale was brought into the White House, and coincidentally just after CIA DDP Richard Bissell was getting the boot, the counterinsurgency czar proposed his detailed outline for Operation Mongoose through a month-by-month timetable of expected covert actions and outcomes. On screen now is the now declassified weekly timetable of the monthly itinerary of Operation Mongoose, which outlined the roadmap to creating a homegrown revolution against Castro from within Cuba itself. The major components of Mongoose included both the infiltration of CIA-backed Cuban exiles to drum up support for a popular uprising, paired with quote-unquote hit-and-run raids against Cuban facilities and industries. This type of hit-and-run harassment has been described as hundreds of small pinpricks that on their own would not amount to much, but altogether could, in theory anyways, create enough disruption and discord to help accelerate the collapse of the Castro government. The initial plan envisioned the popular uprising to take place in October of 1962, a mere 8 months after the proposal of the first Mongoose rubric. This remained exceedingly optimistic and outright delusional to those at the CIA who understood the reality on the ground in Cuba, as Castro had completely consolidated his power after the Bay of Pigs blunder. According to David Korn, quote, Lansdale confessed little was known of the real situation inside Cuba, but nevertheless maintained anti-Castro sentiment was strong enough to support a resistance program, end quote. For the Kennedy brothers and their idealistic new frontiersmen, this was exactly what they wanted to hear. David Talbot, in his book Brothers, relays Lansdale's lofty rhetoric as he compared Operation Mongoose to the American Revolution, stating, quote, Americans once ran a successful revolution. It was run from within, and succeeded because there was timely and strong political, economic, and military help by nations outside who supported our cause. Using this same concept of revolution from within, we must now help the Cuban people to stamp out tyranny and gain their liberty. End quote.
Here's how it works. First, go to riverside.fm and open an account, and then you'll be able to capture high-quality video and audio from practically anywhere in the world. When it comes to editing, Riverside is perfect for beginners. Even if you have zero experience, you can use their AI tools and intuitive editing features to create a professional-looking result. You can get transcriptions automatically and use them to edit like a doc, or you can use the chapter timeline feature, which makes it way easier just to skim and scan. Ready to share? Well, it's okay if you don't have an audience yet. Everybody starts somewhere, and Riverside has perfect tools to help you grow your audience, like live streaming if you're into that, or you can use their AI tools to create automated short clips that you can post on YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, and TikTok to increase your engagement. Your podcast really is just one click away with Riverside. Just bring your idea, we'll do the rest. Try it now, it's free.